Okay, so for the second talk, I will provide data that we as a global rheumatology community have collected about the outcomes of COVID-19 in people with rheumatic diseases. And I will share with you some of the Global Rheumatology Alliance data. And I know many of you have contributed cases to the registry. So it's nice to see all of our work come together. So I'm going to review the answers to 3 questions. So the first one is, are people who are receiving immunosuppressive drugs more susceptible to getting SARS-CoV-2? The second is, what are the outcomes of COVID-19 in immunosuppressed individuals? And then finally, we'll look at whether COVID-19 outcomes are more severe with specific immunosuppressive drugs. So if you think back to the early days of the pandemic, we were all very scared for our patients, and we really didn't know if COVID was going to have severe outcomes in people with rheumatic diseases or not. And at that time, very early on, like March of 2020, based on some of the early data that was coming out, we knew that age was a very strong risk factor for poor COVID outcomes, the strongest risk factor, in fact. But there were a number of comorbidities that were also associated with severe illness: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, lung disease, cancer, chronic kidney disease, obesity. But the CDC here in the US put a question mark by immunocompromising conditions because we really didn't have any data. So let's talk about this first question that we've answered over the last year. And that is, are people who receive immunosuppressive drugs more susceptible to the initial infection with SARS-CoV-2? And I'm going to take you through data from different places in the world. So this was one of the first studies, and it came out of Lombardy, Italy, which, as you know, was very severely impacted, in early 2020. And these rheumatologists actually surveyed all of their patients. Remarkably, they got a 98% response to their survey. And what they found is that the incidence of confirmed COVID-19 in people who had rheumatic disease was actually similar to the general population, and they found no severe complications or death. And so this was early data that was reassuring. So then, data emerged from Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has the great advantage of having the ability to look across the entire population using their databases. And the population of Hong Kong is about 7.5 million, and they had about 1,000 cases of COVID, and only 5 patients with rheumatic disease developed COVID among this group. And therefore, they found that the incidence of COVID-19 was similar between people with rheumatic disease and people in the general population, so consistent with the Italian study. There have also been studies in the US using data from the Veterans Affairs hospitals. They looked at 37,000 people who had inflammatory bowel disease, looked at the cases of COVID, and found that there wasn't an increase in COVID cases among people who were using TNF inhibitors or thiopurines, like, for example, 6-MP, compared to others. So again, very consistent. So, these studies and many other studies have shown that the incidence of COVID-19 in immunosuppressed individuals is similar to the general population. Now, there's a very important caveat here, which is that, people who are immunosuppressed might be more likely to follow precautions for COVID-19. Maybe they're not, leaving the home as much, or they're wearing their mask more strictly. But nevertheless, the consistency of these studies seems to suggest that there isn't too much of a higher incidence. And what we've learned about COVID is that, the initial infection is really determined by the high risk exposure, right? When we look at people who are in prison, or homeless individuals, or people who live in a nursing home, where the big outbreaks occur, it seems like the initial infection is most closely tied to having a high risk exposure, and not necessarily to, the immune system of the host and whether it's immunocompromised. And therefore, we have learned that people with autoimmune disease don't appear to have a higher risk of initial infection compared to the general population. And that's why the American College of Rheumatology guidelines are that people with rheumatic diseases should be counseled on general preventive measures. So, distancing and masks, and now vaccines if they're available, but that they don't need to do some of the things that were being recommended at the beginning of the pandemic, like, for example, not ever leaving their house, or, things that were more extreme. Okay, so let's talk about the outcomes of COVID-19 in immunosuppressed individuals. This was one of the first studies that came out, and it was done in the UK, and they looked at data from 17 million individuals, so a very large study, and they were interested in looking at the risk factors for mortality. And this study, I think, was really nice because it helped put all of these risk factors in perspective. And like I mentioned at the beginning, when you look at this chart, it's age more than any other risk factor that's determining people's outcomes. It's the strongest risk factor. But there are a variety of comorbidities in this study, things like obesity or diabetes or cancer, that are associated with a higher risk. In this study, they also looked at some autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and psoriasis. And they did find that this group of patients has a very slightly higher risk of mortality, even after controlling for all these other things. Since that study, there have been a few additional studies that have basically found something similar. This was a study that was done in New York City, which was also very severely affected with COVID in the earlier part of the pandemic. And what they found is that patients who had rheumatic diseases had a hospitalization rate that was similar to the general population. Later, some of my colleagues in Boston looked at a larger group of people with autoimmune diseases, 2,300 people. And they found that these patients had a slightly higher risk of hospitalization, just like the UK study. You can see that, the risk there is 1.14, so just a little bit above 1. But they didn't find a higher risk of death. And after they controlled for comorbidities, the risk was actually similar to the general population. Now, you can argue whether the comorbidities are separate from the rheumatic disease or if they're part of the rheumatic disease. They can't do that in this study, but nevertheless, it looks like the risk is either similar or slightly higher. This is a more recent study from Sweden, and the Swedish national registries are just a wonderful data source because they can look at their whole population and look at death indexes and so forth. And in this study, they looked at people who had inflammatory joint diseases, so AS, psoriatic arthritis, RA. And they found that there was a slightly higher risk of hospitalization in these patients. And in the models that are highlighted in red, they adjusted for comorbidities. And you can see that the risk is smaller, again, when you adjust for the comorbidities. So all of these studies are actually consistent with each other. And they basically show that the risk of outcomes in patients with rheumatic diseases is very closely tied to their age and to comorbidities. And from the rheumatic disease itself, it looks like the risk of hospitalization or death is similar or only very slightly higher. And so because of this, the ACR and EULAR, I think felt confident saying that immunosuppressive medications should be continued in people who have rheumatic diseases. I'm sure many of you, just like we did here in the States, were getting questions from patients about whether they should stop their immunosuppressive drugs because they were so worried that they were going to get, horrible COVID if they continued the drugs. But actually the data, don't show that there's a very high increase in risk. It's, probably just a slight increase. Okay, so then let's talk about COVID outcomes with some of the specific drugs. And I'll share with you now some of the data that we've generated with the COVID-19 Global Rheumatology Alliance. I want to thank you all for participating in this registry. It really was an amazing global effort. I've never seen anything like it. Everybody came together and entered cases and allowed us to really answer some important questions. There were so many people working on this, so many organizations that really contributed to this registry. And we were trying to answer two main questions. We wanted to understand the outcomes of COVID and people who had rheumatic diseases and, see if we could learn something about our drugs. As many of you know, this registry was started with a Twitter conversation when one of the rheumatologists in Cleveland said, we should start a registry in rheumatology. And then, a bunch of us were having a conversation on Twitter about this. So, I think Twitter was used for some negative things in 2020, but this was one positive use of this social media platform. We launched the registry on March 24th, and through the remarkable participation of people around the world, it now has more than 15,000 cases of people with rheumatic disease and COVID, and has really allowed us to learn a lot. I just want to say that there have been so many people that have helped with just the organization of this very complex, data collection effort, including Phil Robinson in Australia, who's really helped, set up the organization for everything. And then Pedro Machado is in Europe, and he's leading the parallel European registry, and everybody's combining data. It's really important that patients have been so involved in this whole effort. There's a patient board and patient teams who put out, lay summaries for the public, and we really couldn't have done this without them. It's been a wonderful partnership. So here's the distribution of where the cases have come from across the world. We've had enthusiastic participation from our colleagues in Chile. And, in this first analysis, which was in the very early part of the pandemic, so between March and April of last year, we looked at the risk factors for hospitalization. And among these 600 patients, you can see their characteristics here. Most of these patients had rheumatoid arthritis, not surprisingly, although, people also had lupus or psoriatic arthritis, AS, vasculitis. And in this initial analysis, about 46% of patients were hospitalized. So I think people were entering the more severe cases into the registry. And in this first paper, we found, not surprisingly, that age and comorbidities were significant risk factors for hospitalization in people who had rheumatic diseases. We found that the people who were taking biologics were actually doing quite well. And then we also found that people who were taking prednisone, especially at higher doses, like more than 10 milligrams, had a higher risk of hospitalization. It's interesting to think back to that very early part of the pandemic, but people were saying that hydroxychloroquine was going to be, a cure or a good preventive strategy for COVID. And, from this very early registry data, we actually found that there was no association between being on hydroxychloroquine and hospitalization. The effect is, completely null in our registry. And back then in April of 2020, the registry made headline news. The Wall Street Journal, has this headline that says hydroxychloroquine and other autoimmune drugs don't fully protect against coronavirus. Early data suggest data compiled by rheumatology researchers showed dozens of patients who were taking Plaquenil and other drugs became infected. It's hard to believe that this was headline news, but that was like the state of panic, I think, that we were all in. The registry made an important early contribution. So I'll share with you actually this next paper, which came out in January of this year, looking at now about 3,700 patients that were entered in the registry. And, again, we find that age is a very strong risk factor. Male sex is an important risk factor. And, this has come out in the general population as well. Smoking. And then maybe one of the most important contributions of the registry is demonstrating that people with rheumatic diseases who have moderate or high disease activity have more severe COVID. And I think this has been very important for me to share with my patients, that they really need to come in or at least have a telephone encounter so that we can control their rheumatic disease during the pandemic, because uncontrolled disease seems to be associated with worse outcomes. We find that a range of comorbidities are associated with COVID-19. And the color coding here is, we divided this analysis into people who have inflammatory joint diseases like RA and psoriatic arthritis, people who have rheumatoid arthritis, and then people who have connective tissue diseases like lupus. And you can see that the effects are pretty similar across the different diseases. This slide is very interesting. In this analysis, we actually compared various drugs to methotrexate to see, which drugs have a higher risk of death from COVID. And the things that emerge here, sulfasalazine emerges as a risk factor. Immunosuppressant drugs, for example, cyclophosphamide, mycophenolate, tacrolimus, azathioprine, those four look like they're associated with a higher risk of mortality compared to methotrexate. The drug with the very highest risk is rituximab, many-fold increased risk of mortality in our patients that are on rituximab. And then again, the steroids look like they have a significant impact as well. But when you look at some of the other drugs, somebody asked before about IL-6 inhibitors, and you can see that, the point estimates are either null or slightly protective here. So it doesn't look like they're harmful. I don't think we can say that they're helpful either from this data. We've gone on to look at, specific diseases too. So, what about the patients who have rheumatoid arthritis? This is now 1,600 people who have RA and are on biologics in particular. And in this analysis, we compared the various biologics to TNF inhibitors. The people on TNF inhibitors seem to do very well. But again, it's this rituximab group where, you can see these odds ratios are almost fourfold higher risk of progression in terms of the ordinal severity scale in this analysis. We also are starting to see a signal for JAK inhibitors. And, this is still, early data. This is going to be presented at EULAR in a few weeks by Dr. Jeff Sparks, but it looks like there's a slightly higher risk of poor outcomes with JAK inhibitors as well. So let me share with you analogous data from the Swedish National Register. So, one of the shortcomings of our Rheumatology Alliance registry is that, some people are entering cases systematically on every single patient that they see, but other people are entering it in a more ad hoc kind of way. And so, looking at this population-based data from places like Sweden is very important to confirm some of the findings that we're seeing in the Rheum COVID registry. And in this recent paper, it's remarkable that they basically have found the same thing. So rituximab and JAK inhibitors seem to be associated with a higher risk in the Swedish National Registry. Interestingly, they have also seen a signal for sulfasalazine. They were not able to look at steroids, so we couldn't confirm that part, but it looks like in terms of the drugs, both the Rheum COVID registry and the Swedish National Registry are agreeing with each other. And I think that increases our confidence in the findings. We've also looked at lupus patients. Manuel Aguarte-Gil will present this at EULAR in a few weeks. And here it looks like the main risk factors for poor outcomes among people with lupus. It's not surprising that age, male sex, having comorbidities like hypertension or end-stage renal disease are associated with poor outcomes. Not being on a DMARD, our patients who are not treated with anything, including hydroxychloroquine, are doing worse. And then we see, the impact of steroids again. Higher doses are associated with worse disease severity. And then people who have uncontrolled lupus, so those who are having a severe flare of their disease, almost a 4-fold higher risk of severity in this population. So I think actually all of the data are very consistent across these different populations. One thing that we've done is combine the data from the Rheumatology Registry with data from the Inflammatory Bowel Disease Registry, see if we find the same thing. And what you can see here is that in the pooled analysis from both rheumatology and inflammatory bowel disease, we see this effect of steroids, higher doses associated with worse outcomes, higher risk of hospitalization. I just wanted to direct you to the Rheum COVID website, where a lot of these findings are actually summarized, including versions that are plain language summaries for patients. And I think this is actually the most viewed part of the entire website. It's wonderful to see that the information is, getting out to the community. So those were the Rheum COVID findings. I think we've learned a lot over the last year. I wanted to just say a few words about vaccines, because I know people have been asking a lot of questions about that. And, I think we're still very early at this point. And so we don't have a lot of data, but I'll share with you what we know so far. This is a study that UCSF and Washington University collaborated on to look at anti-IgG spike protein antibody levels in people who have received the mRNA vaccines. They looked at 90 patients who had autoimmune diseases like RA and lupus, and 37 control patients. And here you see the level of the anti-spike protein. And so here's the control group, for example, and then people who are on TNF inhibitors, they do have a slightly reduced antibody response, but it still looks pretty robust. Same with JAK inhibitors. What I've highlighted in red here are the patients on rituximab. And you can see that actually most patients have no antibody response. We expect this, of course, but this study just confirms what we already know, that these patients are going to have a low response. And then, not shown here are the people on prednisone. They also found that, there was a reduced antibody response to vaccine in people that were on prednisone, even actually pretty low doses of prednisone, like 5 milligrams. There's going to be studies ongoing to also look at T cell responses, because of course, this B cell response is just part of the story. We need to know how the T cell compartment is responding in order to know the whole picture. But this early data suggests that really it's the rituximab and prednisone patients who might be at risk for a poor vaccine response. This is an early study out of Germany. And these investigators looked at controls versus people with rheumatic disease and just looked at the side effects of the vaccine, the immediate side effects, what's happening to people in terms of, pain in the arm or fever or lymph node swelling and so forth. And not unexpectedly, actually, the people who have rheumatic diseases are less likely to have fever or chills because we're giving them anti-inflammatory drugs, of course. But otherwise, actually, the side effect profiles look pretty similar, maybe slightly more maybe slightly more fatigue in the patients who have rheumatic diseases, but otherwise it looks pretty similar. They also looked at DAS28 in the 42 days following vaccination. And they really didn't see that there were significant flares. But again, this was a very small study. It's like 40 patients or so in the control group and 26 in the rheumatic disease group. But nevertheless, it looks reassuring. Now, you have probably seen some of these case reports that are starting to pop up of immune-mediated disease flares or new rheumatic diseases happening after the vaccines. This is just one of them. 5 centers from Israel, UK, and USA compiled their cases of patients who were flaring after they received the vaccine. They saw 27 flares, 27 cases with 17 flares. And some of these patients had new onset diseases. They were things like idiopathic pericarditis, neurosarcoidosis, demyelinating syndromes, myasthenia gravis. I think that this data is very difficult to interpret without a control group. We really need to know what the background population incidence of these side effects are so that we can see whether this is unusual. And this is, the approach that's been taken with the J&J vaccine and those thrombotic episodes. You look at the background rate of venous thrombosis and compare that to what's happening with the vaccine. So I think, so far, I actually think the data has been pretty reassuring. Millions of people have gotten vaccinated, and there hasn't been a clear signal of, a lot of people developing autoimmune disease so far. But I think the data is still very early, and it's hard to know. So the last thing I wanted to just mention is that, the ACR has its vaccine clinical guidance summary. I've listed the website here. And in terms of, what we tell our patients in practice, the main thing is that most of our medications are recommended for patients to just continue. So things like steroids or hydroxychloroquine, drugs like sulfasalazine, azathioprine, the TNF blockers, and so forth. No modifications when people get the vaccine. They do say that mycophenolate and methotrexate should be held for a week following the vaccination. If people are getting the 2-dose vaccines, they're recommending to hold for 1 week following each vaccination. And for people who are getting 1-dose vaccine, to hold the methotrexate for 2 weeks after the single vaccine dose. So, this is based on really expert opinion and some of that very early data that's come out. And I expect that these recommendations will change, over the next few months, but this is what we're recommending at this point. So in conclusion, what we've learned over the last year, we've actually learned quite a lot. We've learned that COVID-19 outcomes for people with rheumatic diseases are largely driven by older age and comorbidities. We see a consistent signal of worse outcomes with moderate or high doses of steroids. There are some drugs, rituximab, maybe JAK inhibitors, several of our immunosuppressants like cyclophosphamide, mycophenolate, azathioprine, tacrolimus, that are associated with worse outcomes. And, I think these patients, lupus patients and other patients that are taking some of these drugs, should be prioritized for, outpatient or inpatient therapy, and maybe, with the rituximab patients, considering convalescent plasma or monoclonal antibodies if they're available. In terms of vaccine, I'm not convinced that there's a safety signal yet, but the early data is very limited. And it does look like some drugs, especially rituximab, maybe steroids, are going to diminish the vaccine response. But we really need more data to know, which patients have a diminished response and whether these patients will need a booster vaccine, in a few months to really help increase their response. So with that, I just want to thank, everybody who's contributed cases to the Rheum COVID effort. It's, really a group effort from rheumatologists around the world. And I want to thank, really the ACR and EULAR for supporting this effort. We really couldn't have done it without them. And then, if you're interested in learning more, you can subscribe to the mailing list, or we have the Twitter feed and the Facebook feed. The information about Rheum COVID is listed there. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I would be so happy to take any questions.